All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are and whatever you're doing. We hope you're having a great day getting better. I want to say hello and welcome to our new webinar, which is titled Filling the OT Visibility Gap, Improved Detection, Response, and Vulnerability Management. And it is sponsored by OT cybersecurity leader Dragos in partnership with ServiceNow and Swimlane. And this is a true across the sector look at the mission critical landscape of cybersecurity to protect industrial infrastructure. I'm Rod Walton. I'm managing editor with Microgrid Knowledge and Energy Tech. And this webinar is brought to you by those two entities, as well as Attendee World, Utility Analytics Institute, Oil and Gas Journal, and Offshore Magazine. We are all part of the energy sector group within Endeavor Business Media, covering all resources as there are many paths in the energy transition. There are also many paths to cyber danger, and we're learning more and more in the headlines every day. No entity is safe without a real defense plan, and you'll get that today from Dragos, Swimlane, and ServiceNow. So let's get going, though, with some quick introductions of our truly expert group today. And we have Phil Tonkin, who is Field Chief Technical Officer with Dragos. Phil leads the company's strategic guidance on securing industrial operations. And prior to joining Dragos, Phil led the OT security program at one of the world's largest investor-owned utilities for numerous years. With Phil is Robert Rash, who is Outbound Product Management Director with ServiceNow. Robert has more than 20 years experience in OT, industrial automation, engineering, programming, and manufacturing experience, truly versatile and deeply engaged in OT security solutions for manufacturing and utilities. And rounding out this fine front guard of cybersecurity experts is Jay Spann, who is Senior Solutions Engineer at Swimlane, with more than 28 years of experience and a master's degree in computer science. Jay has led technology initiatives for major organizations such as Raytheon and with the Department of Defense. He's renowned for his expertise in IT and OT security. Okay, Jay, Robert, Phil, you've been properly introduced. So let's get started and really dive into these mission critical and timely issues around protecting industrial infrastructure. And welcome, gentlemen. Good to have you here. I want to jump in now. First question up that I would like to ask, and I think a lot of people talk about, the O2 cyber news feeds persistently mentions threats targeting OT environments, and it's important for asset owners and operators to be prepared for those events, right? Well, as we start today's discussion, let's open the aperture from just threats to a broader challenge discussion with, pending regulations, such as in the European Union, you got NIS2, NERC 15.1 for the US coming soon. What are the broader challenges that OT teams will face when trying to fill the OT visibility gap?
Well, I think a good place to start with that is to think about the threat landscape and how it's constantly evolving. One of the big areas that we see, constantly growing capability is within the state actors who are targeting, critical infrastructure in particular. In some cases, that's to carry out active and disruptive effects, and we see that a lot in Europe right now, in particular in relation to the conflict in Ukraine. But we're also seeing other states, particularly targeting to get a foothold in critical infrastructure across the United States and countries like Australia. And we're seeing an ever-increasing motivation from state actors to try and get into the critical infrastructure operators to gather intelligence, to carry out and do reconnaissance on a lot of these assets, and understand how critical infrastructure operators are running their systems. So that's that has always been something that critical infrastructure operators have considered, those nation and level issues and the behaviors of state actors. But we're starting to see other trends as well. There's a constantly growing threat from criminal groups. The rise of ransomware, specifically targeting operational technology operators, has grown and grown. The year on year, we're seeing the numbers increase, in particular in the manufacturing sectors. There's been a huge rise in that space with with the number of groups that are targeting those operations, which are very timely, and the need for them to restore those systems really drives the potential for ransoms to be paid. So we've got this sort of perfect storm happening there between state actors and then the criminal groups. And then you've got this new middle ground where the activist and hacktivist groups, as they're sometimes known, who are groups with often loose affiliations to states, motivated by the behaviors and the geopolitical environment, but carrying out attacks on low-hanging fruit, internet-connected infrastructure, opportunist attacks based on the availability of access into systems, and often not being discreet about how they attack things. So they are straight out there hitting anything that they can find. And recent events we've seen, groups affiliated with Iran, going after any equipment that was manufactured in Israel, regardless of where in the world it is. And we've seen water companies in the US, we've seen water companies in Ireland, all hit by this, the same attacks, just because they were using equipment owned, that were being manufactured, by an Israeli company. And these are bits of equipment that don't belong to huge investor-owned organizations and utilities who can afford lots of defense in depth. These are often assets that are currently connected straight, to the internet, because that's the practical way of achieving that digitization. So we're seeing a real shift there in that threat landscape with both everything from state actors, loosely attributed state actors who've got hacktivist or activist motivation, and then the criminals who are just growing in capability and motivation all of the time. So there's a real rising storm there, and of course because of that we're seeing bolstering legislation. The governments have had long had pieces of legislation in place. NUTSIP is over 20 years old now, well established, but it's being updated and maintained to try and keep that posture as the systems that are targeted, moving further and further down into the operations of these asset owners. So we're seeing with the NIS2 regulations in Europe, revising what came in 6 years ago, and driving the coverage required for that down into much smaller utilities. The new updates to the next SIP regulations requiring monitoring of internal networks right the way down into some of the substations. This is all about keeping pace with that ever-evolving threat landscape. But predominantly, to solve these problems, you've got to be able to picture what's out there, and that's a big challenge. You've got people need to know what are the assets that they're trying to protect, what are those assets doing. That's ultimately how you start to understand the risk landscape that you have within your company.
Yeah, great answer, Phil. I mean, and you're right. The way they are maturing, and sometimes, you don't even know what they're aiming for, and there's just so many ways to try to have to deal with that. And I think I'm going to direct the next question to Jay Spann with Swimlane. And now that we have, because of that answer and things that we've seen, we have a better understanding of the why from the threats, but also the more common compliance and cybersecurity best practice challenges that organizations are facing in OT environments. I mean, it's important to note that no one company provides the proverbial silver bullet, and it's worth noting today that we have 3 companies here represented in this webinar who are all part of that cybersecurity ecosystem, and we're thrilled to have all 3 of you here. So Jay, the question I have is, what is the general solution guidance for companies which are looking to make improvements in this area?
Yeah, great question, Rod. Kind of dovetailing into what Phil was talking about, and the fact that we're seeing not just the regulation, but we have to recognize who the attackers are. What are they looking at? And kind of like your comment about the fact of what are they aiming at, or even do they know that they're aiming at something?
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
obviously, it's all about being opportunistic, but But you definitely hit the nail on the head here when we say, first of all, there are 3 companies here. There's a reason there's 3 companies here. You know, to solve anything in security today, collaboration is the name of the game. You know, you have the idea that you're going to go in there and pick one thing off the shelf and say, oh, yep, I'll take one of those and that's going to solve my problems. Doesn't work like that. What you need to have is you need to have a combined strategy that's using the best of breed, things like Dragos, ServiceNow, Swimlane, where they not only can do what they do very well, but they can dovetail with each other very nicely and complement what you're trying to solve in the way of your OT cybersecurity solution. You know, ultimately with this, the name of the game is managing the risk. So we have to find the best way to manage that risk with a combined set of tools that are going to achieve all aspects of what it is we're looking to do. Now, one of the ways that we're going to be able to do that most successfully is by being able to not only work together, but continue to expand that working together, meaning integrate not just with the 3 tools you see here, but integrate with lots of different tools. You never know when there's going to be that specialty tool or that other element that you're going to say, you know, there's this one process that we're doing and it's kind of manual. If we could do that faster, if we could automate that, that would really help us protect what we're trying to protect in a better fashion. So being able to not only recognize what those are, but being able to integrate them into that fold and tie them into what you're trying to accomplish is very important. Of course, being able to do that means having a very strong understanding of your entire OT environment. It's not enough to understand that OT is what we're trying to protect. It's understanding everything about your OT environment. You might even go so far as to say that you're looking to achieve something that is purpose built for this specific environment. And I think really what that drives us to that I think is maybe one of the most important parts about this is that in order to solve something like this, you have to know what the process is. You have to not only have a process, but know what that process is. A lot of folks that I've come across at events and other places, they'll ask about, well, you know, how do we solve this? Whether it's IT, whether it's OT, whatever the use case might be. And the first answer I have is almost always, what's your process? Because if you go take something that either you don't know the process or you have a poorly designed process, you automate it, you haven't solved a whole lot. You've created a poorly designed automated process. You've not necessarily made it better. So the way to achieve this is not only to have these tools that can work together, but really to have spent the time understanding what is our process that will get us the results we're looking for. Once you have that process, it's a lot easier to go back and make sure that it is fitting into, like Phil was talking about in the last question, the compliance. Are we meeting those objectives? Are we automatically filing our compliance reports? Are we doing things timely? But in my mind, it really boils down to not just selecting those teams and those companies and those products, but knowing how you're going to use them.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it is so complex, and seems like it doesn't need many layers. Very simplistic view, but I think of it as you got this flood of things coming at the systems, you know, cybersecurity dangers, and there's just different filters in there to sort of take out the dangers, you know, at this point, at that point, at another point along the way. And I could see where it would take more than one specific solution. So thanks for that, Jay. Great answer. And Robert, thanks for joining us, Robbie. Sorry. And with that guidance, could you please sort of just provide us with some examples of how your organizations are working together to provide improved potential incident detection, response, and vulnerability management?
Sure, 100%. I think Jay touched on a very important point, right? That this is a very specific environment, and and everybody's aware. ServiceNow has always been, we've always tackled those IT use cases, right? That's what we've been good at for years. But to Jay's point, right, this is a very specific environment. right? And so, obviously the integration to both Swimlane and Dragos is where we pull in that that cyber piece of it. But we had to think about it from that angle of approach of this is an IT environment. What's truly different, right? We've heard this feedback from customers all the way up to the CISO, is the environment is completely different, but the way we're going to carry out these remediations is really where we need to pay attention. And that's what we really thought about when we said, we're going to put together a solution specific for this industrial landscape is let's put the hat on who's actually going to remediate these problems, right? And so the intent there is one, to obviously leverage that individual, right? And the knowledge and the context that we can get from these integrations to give them that information to actually remediate that problem, right? But be able to show that context as well. Right, that context comes in all sorts of forms, right? It's obviously the cyber piece, right, that we're gathering from those integrations, and there's that physical piece, right? We had a recent customer that we kind of did a proof of concept with, and we started with a new facility, which was kind of interesting because their takeaway was it's a new facility. We got about 2,000 or 3,000 connected devices. We're not going to see a lot of vulnerabilities, right? And of course, we had to eat a little crow because as soon as we turned on our security solution, there were about 10,000 vulnerabilities. So, I think we can all understand that if we take that list of vulnerabilities to the plant manager, say, hey, we have a critical issue with security, our version and definition of I want to say severe and his are going to be two completely different things, right? And so what we did, right, is we took that physical piece of it as well as part of that context, right? With those 10,000 vulnerabilities, obviously you're going to hand that to SecOps, right? They're going to ask you either they're either going to laugh at you, right, and say, well, you want me to do 10,000 of these things, or they're going to ask you the most logical question, which one do I start with, right? I mean, what do I prioritize, right? And that's where we start to pull in all of these different angles of approach from that risk perspective to identify truly what should you prioritize within your organization when it comes to vulnerability management. And so that's what we did. So we started to kind of strip away those layers, right? Identify what was truly critical from a threat and a vulnerability standpoint, but also what the thing does in a plant. Right, that's the most critical piece, right? Because with the reality is with those 10,000 vulnerabilities, you might have 500 controllers within your landscape that have exactly the same firmware and exactly the same hardware revision and exactly the same vulnerability, right? And so you're going to have to start to make that determination: do I prioritize one versus the other because this one's responsible for plant or personnel safety or critical production or compliance or whatever the case might be. So now you're taking that list of 10,000 vulnerabilities. And you're starting to narrow that down to a few hundred that are manageable, right? Because they are critical to what you're doing within your process, right? And that's really where that rubber meets the road, right? We want to prioritize those vulnerabilities. And then south of that, right, putting that responsibility of how to deal with those vulnerabilities and the people that can make those determinations, right? SecOps team don't know those devices, right? So they can't make that determination how to deal with it. And the people that are actually going to carry out the remediation, albeit they may be experts in that space, they're not necessarily the master of all things when it comes to an HMI or a SCADA system or a PLC. So we have to start to think about too, right, how to, I want to say, divvy up those responsibilities, right, and simplify that process. There's people at the organizations that at every organization that are responsible for just that landscape. They're the experts in PLCs or the experts in AGVs or robots or whatever the case might be. And so we'll give them that visibility to say, hey, within your landscape, here's these vulnerabilities. And based on all that information that we're going to provide to you from all these sources, how would you suggest we deal with those vulnerabilities? Do we patch this device because it's fairly new? Do we replace it because you're asking for four hours of downtime and the thing's going to be the end of life in 2 months? So it makes more sense to leverage that downtime window to replace the thing instead of patching, right? So there's to provide that correct and I want to say reasonable strategy on how to deal with those vulnerabilities. I think is what's most important. Of course, we've always had the ability to carry out those playbooks, with incident and change management and those sort of efforts.
Yeah. Thank you, Robbie. Appreciate that, and appreciate you sharing that information. It's kind of fascinating to think about how it all, when you work together, who picks up what, who covers what, and just the collaboration, the conversations that go on. As with anything in life, though, implementation doesn't always go as smoothly as we would like, right? And so, Phil, can you just please talk a little bit about some potential implementation gotchas that we should consider as we embark on this journey, speaking of the companies among our attendees?
Yeah, I mean, in particular, before anybody starts to try and build out, any kind of vulnerability management strategy, they need to have a good understanding of what their supply chain looks like. You know, I've had cases in the past where when speaking to potential customers where I'll say, well, what are the OEMs you work with in your space? And they'll say, I don't know. That's why I need a tool like yours to tell me what's in my environment. And all of our tools are really good at giving people that definitive view of what's there. We can help them see the asset that they didn't know they had, or help them understand that that policy they have or process they have is giving them accurate information about the assets within their landscape. But that base understanding of who's even in my environment, you need that before you can really start in the program. You need to understand your supply chain. You need to know who your predominant PLC vendors are, who in the protection and control space for electricity grids. You need to know who's supplying your IEDs and relays into your substations. And many people will say they just don't know that. Many of the engineers know. So this is about the big solution to this problem is not seeing the problem as being an IT security problem to be solved in the OT environment. It's a collaborative security issue. You need to be working with the OT teams, with those teams who know these assets. Make sure that they know that you're not an auditor coming in trying to catch them out. You're instead an advocate who's going to help them with a new engineering challenge that they're trying to solve. And it's about building a collaborative team so that they open up and they tell you, oh, we keep a record of that in a spreadsheet, or unfortunately, it's just in my head, but I need help to scale this and grow this. And so that's what our tools are about. These are tools to help give verification of the things that people know. It's about helping people have the visibility at scale, and sustainability of some of those very manual processes that exist today. But to get started, you need to build really, really good relationships with the engineering workforce. Organizations, you need to build teams. You need to think who are the organizations I'm going to work with to solve this. You can work with us, and our partners, like ServiceNow and Swimlane, but you need to be working with your system integrators and the OEMs, who are ultimately going to be the ones who might be switching on some of these capabilities or allowing us to interface into those systems, because they can stop it. And they could be some of the strongest advocates, but they can also be some of the biggest obstacles if not properly engaged in the process. So know your people, know your supply chain, and work together in collaboration to prepare for the implementation of these solutions can really help, because they understand the real implications of how the systems are being operated. The engineers know what the impact is going to be. And when we think about things like vulnerability management, we'll get a big long list, but we also know from things like intelligence, how exploitable is it? Are the people actively trying that? We know from visibility of networks, are there other controls that might completely mitigate it? But it's the engineer that knows that the impact of that thing happening. I can tell someone you'll get loss of visibility from that PLC, and they'll say, it's okay, I've got another one. Or we can say, oh, you'll completely lose that engineering workstation, and they might say, but we never use it. So that priority is, that knowledge sits in their heads, and you need tools to put it into to help you with that prioritization. So all about teamwork and collaboration.
Yeah, knowledge is power. Go ahead. Jump in.
I was going to add to that a little bit. I mean, obviously, Phil makes a great point there. And not only do we need to know about that supply chain, but one of the things that I think that we've kind of not only talked about here, but we're trying to amplify is draw on the experience of the partners that you do have. So, when you're going in to do something like this, take advantage of what Dragos can tell you and what their expertise is. Take advantage of what ServiceNow can tell you about other engagements and what their expertise is. Take advantage of what Swimlane can tell you about things that people maybe have not realized. Hey, we can automate this, or do you have this particular tool, or how do you solve this problem, and is there a more efficient way to do it? So one of the things that I think we have certainly seen when it comes to implementation gotchas is not doing enough of that discovery, which I think is kind of what Phil was outlining, is knowing all of the pieces that are really important here. Yes, you can go in and take a look at your OT environment and say, we're going to solve for this, but if you don't know how that stuff is getting there and you don't know the entire picture, you are asking for trouble. And the same thing is true when you're going in and trying to solve the problem of what you're going to do with that process. If you don't have all of the pieces to that puzzle, then you don't have a complete picture, and therefore you're not going to get the best result. But one of the things you can definitely do is draw on the expertise of those partners. And like Phil said, ask a lot of questions. Go talk to those people. Go find those engineers that have that stuff in their head, but get it documented.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I mean, so many things to think about, but just having those communications, those conversations, that back and forth, so key. And so I kind of want to wind up with another question before we go into our attendee Q&A, gentlemen. And Robert, I'll just start with you, and anybody can jump in, but just final thoughts, insights, key takeaways, and where we can get some more information on the next steps that we should consider.
Well, for sure. We have a ton of resources. The last one first, right? We all three of us have a ton of resources on our web, and you can all reach out to any of us directly, right? Post this call to engage further. I think both Jay and Phil really mentioned a really important part. It does take a village, and I want to say every implementation I've been privy to within ServiceNow, it's typically a matter of I'm introducing the IT and security teams and SecOps SOC teams to the operation folks. These folks work together day to day, and they have never talked to each other, prior to our engagement, right? And I think that's, Phil mentioned it, that's a critical piece of this, right? There's that physical aspect that we don't realize. Now, one thing that we have noticed, and I want to share this with all the security folks, right, is 100% of the time there's always this fear and depredation from the security team, help desk, anyone in IT and support, that reaching out to those plant people to say, hey, we need your help, they're going to get immediate pushback and say, we're not interested, there's too much time and that sort of thing. And what I've seen 100% of the time, it is completely the opposite. They are way beyond willing to help, provide their feedback and their input, and they want to weigh into those decisions and to those playbooks and those remediation efforts when it comes to security. Because here's the realization, right? Every single one of those, and this is my the space I came from, the realization is if you step foot into their space, right, they know without a doubt that's going to equate to downtime, right? And IT security going to touch my stuff, you're going to break something, right? You don't know what it is, right? And that's why we've always had that separation in sand. What happens, though, transparently, right, when we start to engage with these customers and start doing this implementation is now you're reaching out to that same group of people to provide you that sheet of music and that context for you to be able to do your job in terms of remediation and vulnerability response and prioritization. So obviously now you have the information that you need, right, to carry out, those efforts, but they're starting to understand that now these same group of people have the same sheet of music that we provided, right? So you're inherently building that trust within an organization, which I think is just painfully critical in today's world, right? It's just with the technology and advancements and the things that we're seeing within there.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you. Prescient points there, gentlemen. And, with that, that's all I got. We've got some experts and excellent questions from our attendees. So I want to just remind our attendees that we're going to start the Q&A portion now. You're welcome to jump in at any time. You don't have to, now that we've started doesn't mean that you can't send in a question. We'll be looking for them up as long as we can. So just a reminder that we'll get to as many as possible. And if you haven't submitted, do that now. But we're going to go ahead and get started with our Q&A, gentlemen. Let's look at the first one. This is a really, wow, this one here. And I think I'll direct this one to you, Phil, first, and then, Jay and Robbie, you guys can jump in as you like later. But in the OT world, where we all should be following and applying the top 20 critical controls, how can we integrate asset management, vulnerability management, and risk management? Specifically, how can we identify vulnerabilities existing within our environments and prioritize mitigations effectively? And this is a multi-part question. So lastly and importantly, we need to be including IT and OT vulnerabilities and OT vulnerabilities, all of that, since we need to address software tools, browsers, etc., existing on engineering stations, etc., PLCS, SIS, DCS, and SCADA, of course. So Phil, I'll let you start with that one. It's It's a multi-tiered question. Excellent question.
Sure. Right. So yeah, firstly, you consider the homogeneous nature of a lot of OT environments now, and this is it's a trend, but it's something that's existed for a long time now. Most SCADA environments are using Windows-based systems. If you look at the level 3 of most OT environments, they're using IT-like equipment. The enterprise-grade servers, enterprise switches, doing OT things. So the way in which we architect and the way we use things is OT, not the stuff. So the software, the vulnerabilities, and the like that need to be managed at the top level of OT, in particular in the network perimeter space, are very IT-like vulnerabilities. It's just why it's important and how it's important that changes because of the OT nature. So you need to consider what are the threats and how are they being exploited. If you try and tackle every single vulnerability, that's not good risk management. You can't possibly handle the volume of work that needs to be done. And a very important way of understanding what the risks are to you, you need to understand the likelihood. And the likelihood is a factor of who is targeting me, why are they targeting me, how are they likely to do that, what capability do people have out there that might have those motivations. And you take that concept of capability and motivation, you think about it in the context of your own organization, you can then start to understand what are the types of threat that I specifically need to mitigate. And then when you understand the intelligence around that, you can start to think, how might they attack my IT, the stage 1 attacks? And that's where your good IT vulnerability management can also be prioritized. But you start to think about the crown jewels within the IT space. What are the IT things that might lead into my OT environment? And, and make sure that they are being prioritized by the IT SecOps type organizations. As you move into the OT space and you start to layer in these things and you think about the true exploitability of some of those vulnerabilities, and you layer on top of that the capability that the actors have and their motivation in your space, we believe there are only 3 to 4% of vulnerabilities that really need to be addressed right now. They are typically things that are on the perimeter. Those launch pads for attacks further down into this environment. So whilst we talk a lot about the capability growing all of the time, the number of threats constantly increasing, typically the mitigations around some of those threats they remain the same. And it is a good risk-based, prioritized vulnerability management process that layers in all of that knowledge. But when you're talking about very distributed assets, you've got potentially hundreds of sites, each with thousands of connected devices, and each, whilst we talk about OT systems becoming homogeneous, what they're doing is still heterogeneous. Each site is designed and codified to do a particular thing and have a particular output. And so you layer in those complexities. That's a difficult thing for a human being to do alone without the right tools to enable them. And so codifying that knowledge into workflows, having the tools to manage those asset repositories and building out that information is super important. And this isn't just about threat. There's still a huge amount of benefit that can come in terms just as in good asset management, good risk management, positioning yourself for the future. It's not about live scary threats happening right now. It's just it can often be about just having a really good understanding of what's there, so that you can articulate that you're managing it. Particularly when we work with utilities, utilities are used to managing risks. They do risk management in emergency response all day long, every day, and have done for the last 60 years. That's whether they're dealing with the weather, whether they're dealing with social changes, environmental changes. These businesses are designed to be resilient. We're just helping them deal with a new type of threat where there's a motivated actor who has intent. None of those other things have intent. Weather doesn't have intent. Geology doesn't have intent. It's not deliberately trying to do things. And that's the reason cyber is different. It shifts and it changes. But we're just giving people new tools to help them continue to be resilient in this space by helping them understand their assets at a different level of detail that they needed to before, so they can do that great asset management that's allowed them to keep transformers running for 60 years and circuit breakers running for 40 years. This is, how do we help them to keep digital devices, safe, secure, and resilient, for the 20-year life cycle or more that they may need to be out there.
Yeah, that's a great point, Phil. I think one thing that I really liked about that question was the fact that they were talking about a lot of areas that I think sometimes people tend to look at separately, and there's a reason for that, whether it's the asset management or the vulnerability management, but maybe sometimes don't recognize how integrated those can be, especially when you're combining the elements of these three teams. You know, you're talking about the ability to recognize with Dragos what the threats are. You're talking about the ability to manage what those asset lists are, or what those tickets are with ServiceNow. You're talking about the ability to then tie all of that together with any and all potential tool that you might use to address that use case with Swimlane and being able to automate that. So one of the things that I think is important to recognize is that when you do have these types of tools and these teams working on a problem like this, you can address those more holistically and get hopefully a better result. But I do think that's one thing that often people don't recognize as being maybe the art of the possible. So it definitely would be something that I think could be expanded on. I mean, I don't know, maybe you have some additional thoughts on that.
I'm with you 100%. I think they're one and the same, right? And so much so, there are more mature customers in that space, in that VR space. They've really kind of drove us to actually release a new product to tie into those two. Because if you think about, and I think Phil mentioned it as well, right? If you're going through that concept of, let me start to investigate my vulnerabilities and how I'm going to actually go about remediating, right? How am I going to fix this problem? That asset lifecycle, and that actually ties very much into that story and how you're going to deal with those things. Again, I kind of used the example with that previous customer, right? They had to make the determination. Phil mentioned it, right? These things are designed to work 30, 40 years, right? So obsolescence is a huge concern, right? So if, obviously that plays into that conversation of how I'm going to deal with this vulnerability, right? If this device is no longer available or it's reached the end of its life cycle, right? Again, that makes more just logical sense. Let's replace that device because we're going to leverage that downtime and try to search the internet for a CD that we can have mailed to us, right? Because the patch is no longer available online, right? Just
Right.
Where the rubber meets the road, right?
Great point.
We've seen all that before.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a great question. And, it was worth noting that the question comes from a point, within like the midstream side of the energy industry, their own challenges there, their own purposes and all of that. And as I look around at all the various sectors involved, whether it's an energy company or a producer or a utility or a university or they're all dealing with the same kind of threats, really. Whether it's an MGM or a Colonial Pipeline or what have you. So that brings up a really good segue into another great question here. And I just curious about this. I saw this come in, and it is basically, can you talk about what is the percentage breakdown of cyber attacks in OT by, within oil and gas, automotive, utilities? I mean, is there a favored target? Is there one that's just more common than another?
Yeah, the standout target, in particular when you think about the criminal activity and for a ransomware, is manufacturing. And that there's a number of factors to that. One is their rapid digitization. You can't really do modern manufacturing and supply chain without significant connectivity between your IT and your OT. And that really stood out to me recently in some events in Denmark with a state actor targeting their energy infrastructure. And many of the affected organizations, they did what digitally what they know as islanding. I'm cautious of using the term islanding when talking about energy companies because it means something else. But the English translation of their documents used that word, but they effectively disconnected their IT from their OT. That is a huge luxury, and it is something that is very unlikely to be able to happen in the future. I think is the traditional depth of organizations in the electricity transmission distribution space that allows them to have IT very loosely connected for efficiencies to their control centers, which have very dedicated links down to their substations. These are things that we're seeing blurring and blending a lot, and in manufacturing, that blur just doesn't exist. It's a clear connectivity. You need your semi to turn up in a warehouse and know exactly what it's going to get loaded onto it from a robotically led warehouse. It's going to be delivering specific lists of goods to specific stores. You can't have those kind of IT and OT separation when you've got that. The connectivity has to exist, even if it's segmented and there's specific controls around that connectivity. The connectivity has to be there. So that's one factor. The other one is around the business model of ransomware actors. Those ransomware groups, they need to know that if they ransom you, you're going to get paid. They want their money. If you ask an energy company, if I was to ransom that substation or take out that power station, what's it going to cost? The answer, you'll get a lot of engineers sort of going, it depends. And actually because it's complicated. They have their remuneration is based on reliability standards. Those reliability standards are often exceeded, so it's not easy to quantify what 1 minute of outage time means. So when they're thinking about risks, they're good at it, but when actually, when it comes to it, what would it actually mean? If you start attacking power grids as a criminal group, you're going to attract a lot of attention. So if you go to a manufacturer and say, what does 1 hour of downtime on this line mean? They can tell you. They can tell you exactly what it's going to cost them, and then they can start to do the cost benefit of paying the ransom versus trying to restore manually and the like. So I think there's those two factors are considerable when it comes to why manufacturing is the main target by a long way in that space. But where the lines are becoming blurred is in the supply chain, where it's linked into the energy industry. We've seen organizations like some of the major wind turbine manufacturers and automation vendors actually being ransomed, and they have connectivity into the operational assets now of these energy companies. So there are consequential impact there, and it's quite that is quite significant. And so I think we see state actors. They're after the the very high value energy infrastructures. They're still there, pre-positioning for future capability, lots of reconnaissance, lots of data exfiltration and remote access. And in the criminal space, they're targeting the manufacturers more than anybody else.
Yeah, I think, Phil, you one of the things that you kind of amplified for me with that is part of the answer to that question goes back to who is the attacker? What's their primary motivation? Because if it's going to be that monetary motivation, we got to look at where does the profitability lie. And if it's going to be someone where it's more of an act of war or, trying to cause maximum disruption or pain and not so much about the monetary, obviously a little bit different motive, different avenue of attack that they're going to choose. So right. That's kind of one of the key takeaways that I took from that.
Yeah, I think the monetary motivation, that's always been my answer, like follow the money. We recently had, it was last summer, and it's public news, so you feel free to research after the call. But we had an existing customer have a ransomware event within one of their manufacturing facilities, and what was interesting, right, wasn't the amount of money it cost the customer. I think the total check that they had to write was about $85 million was the amount of impact that they seen with this one facility. But what was more interesting was the breakout of that, right? Everybody can imagine, right? Regardless if it's manufacturing, utilities, or if it's OT or IT, right? If you have some sort of security event, it's an anthill, right? Everybody's trying to keep their names out of the media, right? They're trying to contain the threat, doing that operation of things, right? It's hair on fire, right? And that was exactly the environment that they experienced within the plant floor. Now, what was interesting, right, is you could imagine if your main focus is to contain that threat, there's not going to be any care or attention taking into obviously what you should, properly shutting down equipment, making sure the area is safe, doing those sort of things. And they're just blindly unplugging things from ports, right? They're hitting e-stops, they're hitting breakers and that sort of thing. So a percentage of that $85 million wasn't the check that was actually going out to the threat actors. A percentage of that was literally for purchasing new equipment and repair of equipment that was broken as a result of that remediation effort, right? They experienced, I think it was almost 3 weeks of downtime as a result of that ransomware, long after they had paid off and got their information back and their network and that sort of thing back. So I think the actors are starting to be very cognizant of that in that manufacturing space, to Phil's point. and they're following the money, right? It's become a very lucrative environment for them.
Yep.
Yeah. Great answers. I mean, and you know, it is a war out there, and the defenses are constantly evolving and changing as well as the actors. And one of the questions that was brought up here, noting something that was talked about much earlier in the discussion, was the mention of the NERC SIP, and I believe it's 15.1, is an updated policy coming out. So the attendee was just asking if we can provide some color around that, I guess.
Yeah. So I mean, the main event of SIP 15 in the update there is the expansion into what's known as internal network security monitoring. So it's you know, there's a real shift into, you know, beyond, you know, some of the traditional controls that have existed in this space for some time. You know, there are many things that have been around securing endpoints, you know, verification of controls, username, password management, vulnerability management that have existed for some time. This is about monitoring those networks, looking for change, looking for variation in what's normal, you know, and identification of risks in this space and threats in this space. You know, so it is, and the scope of it moves further down into the networks than people have traditionally looked at. You know, there's a lot of segmentation that comes from people's management of NERC SIP. You know, there's a lot of, still in the U.S. power sector, you know, there's a lot of use of serial links and the like to try and, you know, mitigate some of the compliance risks, you know, that exist in this space, as much as the, you know, what the threat actors do. And, you know, so the requirement to monitor those networks is new, and, you know, so, you know, still, you know, it's going through the final stages. You know, it's, you know, being, it's had to be, you know, voted in by a number of members, and you know, and the final legislation out there. But yeah, it's all in the public domain. If you search on SIP 15, you know, as you know, there's a huge amount of information there, and you know, it's obviously a very interesting time for, you know, for organizations out there trying to help these, you know, companies meet these new standards that are being set. You know, we want to try and make sure that people have got the tools that are needed to get these capabilities out there, but doing it in a way which is proportional to the risk. You know, we've got to be really careful that, you know, we don't make some mistakes at the pass to implementing new legislation. You know, it's a lot of new legislation coming in across the world, you know, Australia, the Middle East, Europe. You know, everybody's pushing to legislation because they want to motivate private organizations to do something about these state-level risks. You know, there's my own risk appetite as an asset owner versus the risks to the you know, the country that I'm supporting and operating within. And so legislators and governments are obviously working very hard to try and secure the highest organizations that they can. And I think it also addresses, you know, another question from one of the, you know, the other attendees is, you know, what can governments do to address this risk? There's a lot they can do, because people are more interested in compliance risk than they are in threat. You know, and that's because it's much more measurable. It's much more costly, you know, for lots of organizations. There's no gamble in it. You know, if I don't mitigate my risks against a threat actor, there's a probability that I'll be hit. If I don't manage my compliance risks, I will be hit and I will be fined. So people do deal with compliance better. It's why it's a good motivator. But making sure that the controls are proportional to the threats is really important. We saw this after Colonial, the immediate rush to try and implement very detailed legislation, some very specific controls that didn't always make sense in the pipeline space, where there'd previously been a void. We don't want to see that. It's not good for asset owners and doesn't really manage the risk. So careful implementation of proportional controls against these risks is what, you know, legislators can do. And this is what INSM has become. There was a real risk that it was going to be monitor all of your substations, and I think now people are being much more proportionate about how they can implement them, where it can be implemented. Timelines for implementation need to be realistic, and you know, and that's what's gone into this work, and you know, the great work of the committees that have written it to make sure that it isn't just a rush to implement another tool, but it's something that's actually going to manage risk in these spaces.
Yeah, thank you for that, Phil. And I think you alluded to this. One of the questions that really plays off of that is what role and can industry standards and regulations play in driving better OT visibility, and cybersecurity practices?
Yeah, well, I think it is just, sorry, go on, please.
I'm sure you've got a great answer to this, Phil. I was just going to say, you really kind of hit the nail on the head with that earlier about talking to the aspect of, when people see that there is a compliance aspect, then it's measurable. They know we need to do something. Here's the repercussions of it. And without that, there's not enough guidance there on, how do we measure this? How do we measure the importance of this? How do we decide what needs to be done? So I think you definitely we're headed in that direction. You probably got some other great stuff to add to it, but I thought that was a great point.
Yeah, I mean, is when you think about the legislation that exists today, it typically has focused on the very highest value institutions, the transmission networks, some of the very largest generators. But one of the things that is becoming more and more complex in our energy mix is that we're going from having hundreds of very large power stations to thousands of very small distributed energy assets, and so that's a particular area where the legislation doesn't currently hit it. These assets are too small to actually have an impact, but are large enough that the cumulative risk around them is quite significant to society. You've got the bulk electricity system is currently broken down into a number of categories. So you can have a bulk, medium level substation, but you could just as easily go after a network of recloses or large solar sites and create much greater impact than you would from taking out a single substation. So in this space, I think that's where we've got to think that as we start to decarbonize our economy and we start to implement much smaller but equally important assets when scaled up, and we think about aggregated risk, that the right and affordable legislation is written, and I think that's where we can work between private industry in the cybersecurity sector and in the energy sector to help lead legislators to come up with the right proportional controls to manage some of those risks.
Great answer. Thank you, guys. And you mentioned different kinds of attacks, different sectors, and I think about the phishing things that we always read about, and then MGM, I believe, was a social engineering attack. So with the methods of attack changing all the time, this is a question from an attendee. With methods of attack changing all the time, how does a client develop a truly mature type of cyber defense plan? Is maturity even a possibility? Can we ever reach a point of going, well, I've seen this before and I understand it better, Yeah,
I actually think it's interesting that when we look at the behaviors of many of the most sophisticated actors, their true strength is persistence. Yep, they're developing new capabilities, more scalable tools, more adaptable tools, but many of the techniques and tactics and procedures that they use are reused. There are very few day zeros that are used. The most advanced state actors, I'm sure they have very futuristic capabilities, but we don't see them using them. They don't need to. The actions of the VaultSite group, that we know to be linked to the Chinese government, they're exploiting known vulnerabilities in very common externally facing assets. Firewalls and remote access solutions. We see the actions that are being used by all the state level APT groups, constantly using the same vulnerabilities. They've developed sophisticated methods of exploiting them, but if you know those assets and you're managing them, they're not going to come after you, and they're not going to be burning brand new tradecraft for some time. So we've seen with advanced capabilities in the social engineering space, seen things like AI being used to do that in a more and more convincing way. How do you get in initially? But once they get in, they're living off the land. They're maintaining persistence by utilizing known existing techniques and vulnerabilities, and that's why if you were to look at something like the SANS 5 critical controls, if you implement them, they just work. and having a risk-based vulnerability management process and having good visibility of your assets as just two of those controls, it's still possible to mitigate a majority of both the criminal groups that are out there and the state actors. And so it really is very defendable. And by continuing to collaborate and share and work as a community against these groups, we are going to be able to stay ahead of them. And that's been the real shift over the last few years. Some of the big OT things that we look at now, if you think about, the pipe dream malware that was, has been discovered and analyzed, ahead of it ever being used, issues with some Rockwell PLCs, the collaboration between Rockwell, U.S. government, and the security community to get ahead of those vulnerabilities before ever being exploited. We're not following the smoking gun anymore and reacting to what people have done. We're getting ahead of these adversaries. So I think it's really defendable. And I think it just means that we've got to remain proactive, got to think ahead. Good threat intelligence and a good understanding of our assets will really get us there.
Great, Phil. Thank you. Yeah, excellent. Well, I think we've got time for one more question here. And this is a really good one and a specific one. And I think anybody can jump in on this. But in your experience, have you seen weaponized ransomware targeting HMIs or PLCs?
Not PLCs, but HMIs, yes. Yeah, and that's been, it started a couple of years ago, with some specific references to file types only used, in some GE SCADA systems, but we've seen it more and more now that the file types that are used are, understood. So they're very, definitely targeting those, but it's unnecessary given ultimately that they're based on Windows or Linux file systems and the ransomware just works to encrypt all of the content. So yes, we know that people understand the value of it. We've even seen ransomware groups pretend to have been in OT by doctoring screenshots from HMIs and things. And I've seen there is academic work that's out there about how people might begin to encrypt PLCs. But right now, it doesn't match their business model, and it's not necessary for them to achieve their outcomes. They can achieve the outcomes and the pressure that they want by using the same malware that they use in IT and getting through into OT on SMB communications and and RDP communications. RDP is a ransomware deployment protocol. Those capabilities, they don't need to keep developing them, not yet. Doesn't mean that people shouldn't be thinking about it and thinking about it at an academic level. But in terms of today's risks, mitigating the vulnerabilities that are being utilized, against the types of hosts which are common across IT and OT, having good segmentation between IT and OT can mitigate a majority of the threats in that space.
100%. Yeah, that's. I think that customer I mentioned, I think that was an attack on an HMI itself. An HMI was targeted. What's interesting about those type of devices and the PLCs that they mentioned in the question, these aren't edge devices, right? These are devices, obviously, to provide levels, control, right, within the landscape, right? And so that's not going to be the only thing impacted within a plant, right, or within a factory or within a substation or that sort of thing if they target one of these devices. So I think to scale up from that, being proactive about those things, that good mitigation strategy and how to respond to those incidents as well is kind of key when you're thinking about either one of those type of devices, HMI or PLC, because they kind of live in that same space, right? They're very critical to the operation, right? You're not going to just take off one of those devices offline and expect the rest of the facility to keep functioning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, fascinating. Yeah. I mean, and there's so much. And it's great. You guys did a great job. Unfortunately, we've hit the top of the hour and we've run out of time for questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. There's still a bunch there. But for those we didn't, I believe our presenters will try to address those as they can, as time allows, perhaps by email. But I thank you for sending those in. And with that, we end our webinar, Filling the OT Visibility Gap, Improved Detection, Response, and Vulnerability Management. And I'd like to thank our sponsor, Dragos, in partnership with ServiceNow and Swimlane for sponsoring today's webinar, and our truly excellent panel today, Phil Tonkin of Dragos, Robert Rash of ServiceNow, and Jay Spann of Swimlane. Gentlemen, great job today, and thank you so much. And I just want to remind our audience that we will have a recording of this webinar. It will be available soon, and those who've registered will be notified by email when that link is up. It will be on the Endeavor business media sites I mentioned earlier, including Microgrid Knowledge, Energy Tech, T&D World, Oil and Gas Journal, Utility Analytics Institute, and Offshore. And we've got energy covered from the wellhead to the solar panel and all of the energy transition. So that concludes today's presentation. I want to say thank you to our audience as well for participating and for great questions. We're all in this together and we all learn from each other. I'm Rod Walton. Have a great day, everyone, and hope to see you again soon on a future webinar. Have a wonderful day and goodbye for now.
Thank you, Rod. Appreciate you.
Hey, everybody.